I was sitting at a five-star oceanfront resort in Cabo San Lucas when my phone vibrated with a message from an anonymous number. Fly home immediately. Do not say a word to your parents. Do not sign anything. I had no idea that the innocent-looking piece of paper my family was aggressively pushing across our dinner table was designed to steal $80 million from me, or that by midnight I would be fleeing the resort like a fugitive, about to uncover a 22-year-old lie that would destroy my entire family. My name is Madeline. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant in Los Angeles. I spend my days tracking down hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and following the money trails that criminals desperately try to hide. Ironically, it never once occurred to me to audit my own father. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members to protect yourself. The evening started like every other forced family vacation I had endured since childhood. We were dining on the private terrace of a ridiculously expensive resort in Mexico. The ocean breeze was warm, the champagne was flowing, and the tension at the table was suffocating. This entire trip was supposedly a celebration. My father Richard and my stepmother Caroline had insisted on flying us all down to celebrate my younger half-sister Penelope and her upcoming business milestone. Penelope was launching an initial public offering for her luxury jewelry brand, a company supposedly fully funded by my father. I sat quietly cutting into my sea bass, accustomed to my role as the invisible backdrop to Penelope's shining moments. Ever since I was sent away to a disciplinary boarding school at 11 years old for allegedly pushing Penelope down the stairs, a complete fabrication by Caroline, I had been treated as the defective branch of the family tree. Caroline swirled her wine glass and looked at me with her signature blend of pity and disdain. "You really should try to enjoy yourself, Madeline," she said loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "You work entirely too hard at that boring little accounting firm. Number crunching all day must be so soul-crushing. You should ask Penelope for some lifestyle advice now that she is about to be a CEO of a public company." Penelope flipped her perfectly highlighted hair and laughed. "Oh, Mom, do not tease her. Not everyone has the vision to build an empire. We need people like Madeline to do the tedious paperwork." I forced a polite smile and took a sip of my water. I had learned a long time ago that reacting to their bait only fueled their cruelty. I just wanted to finish my dinner, survive the remaining 2 days of this trip, and go back to my quiet, independent life. But my father had other plans. Richard cleared his throat, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and reached into his leather briefcase resting on the empty chair beside him. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and a heavy gold pen, sliding them directly across the table until they stopped next to my plate. "Since we are all together, we need to handle some quick housekeeping," Richard said smoothly. His voice carried the same practiced authority he used in his corporate boardrooms. "This is just a standard family tax document. My accountants need it signed by all dependents before the end of the fiscal quarter to clear the way for Penelope's company to go public without any tax liabilities. Just sign on the yellow sticky tabs and we can order dessert." I looked down at the stack of papers. A strange, cold feeling settled in my stomach. In my line of work, the phrase standard tax document usually meant someone was hiding something. I pushed my plate aside and pulled the documents closer. I did not reach for the pen. "What exactly is this for?" I asked, flipping past the cover page. Caroline sighed loudly and dramatically rolled her eyes. "Honestly, Madeline, do you always have to make everything so difficult? Your father is managing a massive financial transition for the family. Just sign the paper so we can celebrate." I ignored her and kept reading. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal jargon. My brain, trained to spot inconsistencies and hidden clauses, immediately went to work. This was not an IRS form. There were no tax schedules attached. The wording was deliberately obfuscated, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Irrevocable waiver, full relinquishment of beneficiary rights, indemnification from past fiduciary duties. "Dad, this is not a tax document," I said, looking up at him. My voice was calm, but my heart had started to hammer against my ribs. This looks like a waiver releasing someone from a trust or a conservatorship. I am not signing this until I read the entire thing. The temperature at the table seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Richard's charming smile vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating glare. Penelope slammed her fork down against her plate. "This is exactly why nobody wants you around," Penelope snapped. "You are so paranoid and jealous. Dad is trying to make sure my initial public offering goes smoothly, and you are acting like he is trying to scam you. You do not even have any money for anyone to steal. You are just a glorified bookkeeper." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Madeline, you are embarrassing me. I flew you down here. I paid for your five-star suite, and I am asking you for one simple signature to help your sister. Are you really going to be this selfish?" The pressure was immense. For a split second, the wounded 11-year-old girl inside me wanted to just sign the paper to make the yelling stop, to earn a rare nod of approval from my father. But the 33-year-old forensic accountant knew better. The discrepancy between what they were saying and what this document actually represented was massive. I needed space to figure out my next move. "I need to use the restroom," I said abruptly, standing up from the table. "I will look at it when I get back." "Do not take all night," Caroline muttered, signaling a waiter to bring another bottle of champagne. "We are waiting on you." I walked away from the terrace, feeling their eyes boring into my back. I practically ran through the resort lobby, desperate for a moment of silence to process what I had just read. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the women's restroom and locked myself inside one of the marble stalls. I leaned against the door, taking deep breaths, trying to steady my racing pulse. Why would my father need me to relinquish beneficiary rights? Beneficiary to what? My biological mother had died when I was a toddler, and I was always told she left nothing behind but hospital bills. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The noise made me jump. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from a phone number I did not recognize. I stared at the bright screen in the dimly lit stall. The message read, "Fly home. Don't say anything to your parents. Don't sign it." A chill washed over my entire body. I read the words again, my thumb hovering over the screen. Who was this? How did they know what was happening right now, at this exact moment? I typed a quick reply asking who they were, but the message failed to deliver. The number was blocked or untraceable. I stood frozen in that resort bathroom, the pieces of a puzzle I did not even know existed rapidly clicking into place. The unexpected luxury vacation, the aggressive push to sign unread documents, the specific legal wording I had spotted. I was being set up. I did not know the full truth yet, but my gut told me that if I went back out to that table and signed that paper, my life would be ruined. I shoved my phone back into my pocket. I was not going back to the table. I was getting out of Cabo tonight. I took one last look in the mirror, splashed cold water on my face, and pushed open the restroom door. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my posture to slump. I needed an exit strategy that could not be argued with. As I stepped into the hallway, I spotted her. Caroline was standing near a decorative fountain about 50 feet away, pretending to admire the architecture, but her eyes were fixed dead on the restroom exit. She had followed me. She was making sure I did not bolt. I immediately clutched my stomach and bent forward, letting out a sharp groan. I stumbled toward the terrace where my father and Penelope were waiting. I made my face contort in manufactured agony. "Dad," I gasped, leaning heavily against an empty chair. "Something is very wrong. I think it was the sea bass. I feel violently ill." Penelope recoiled, pulling her designer dress away from me. "Oh my God, get away from the table! You are going to ruin my night!" Richard stood up, his jaw clenched in frustration. "Madeline, stop being so dramatic. Sit down and sign the paper." I dry-heaved loud and convincing. "I cannot. I need to get to my room right now. I'm going to be sick." Before Richard could grab my arm, I turned and practically ran toward the resort lobby. I heard Caroline's heels clicking furiously behind me, but I did not stop. I maintained my hunched, desperate sprint all the way to the elevators, slipping inside and hitting the button for the fourth floor, just as Caroline rounded the corner. The door slid shut, severing her furious glare. The second I stepped into my suite, the performance ended. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, threw the deadbolt, and fastened the security chain. I did not turn on a single light. If Richard or Caroline checked from the courtyard below, I needed the room to look pitch black, exactly like someone who had passed out from severe food poisoning. I moved by the faint moonlight filtering through the balcony curtains. I grabbed my suitcase from the closet and began throwing my clothes inside. I did not bother folding anything. My hands moved with a frantic mechanical precision. Shoes, toiletries, laptop charger. Everything went into the bag. My mind raced with questions about the massive financial fraud I had just narrowly avoided, but I forced myself to focus purely on the logistics of escape. My phone buzzed on the mattress. A text from Richard. "Open this door immediately. We need that signature tonight." I ignored it, zipping my suitcase shut. I changed out of my dinner dress into a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. I grabbed my passport and secured it in my hidden money belt. I crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I knew Richard would not give up easily. Taking the main elevator was a death sentence. They would intercept me in the lobby. I remembered seeing a service door near the ice machine earlier that afternoon. I eased my deadbolt open, wincing at the metallic click, and slipped into the corridor. I moved like a shadow down the carpeted hallway. I reached the heavy metal door marked strictly for staff use and pushed it open. The concrete stairwell was cold and echoed with the hum of the resort air conditioning units. I hurried down 4 flights of stairs, my suitcase bouncing quietly against my leg. I pushed through the ground floor exit and emerged into the humid night air behind the resort kitchens. Dodging delivery trucks and taking advantage of the shadows, I circumvented the main gate and walked briskly down the palm-lined driveway until I hit the main road. My chest heaved. I flagged down a passing local taxi, a battered yellow sedan, and threw myself into the back seat. "The airport," I told the driver in breathless Spanish. "As fast as you can, please." The driver nodded and hit the gas. The tires screeched against the asphalt as we sped away from the luxury compound. As the resort lights faded in the distance, my phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and watched the notifications flood the screen. "Caroline, you are acting like a petulant child. Open the door." "Penelope, you are ruining my trip. Dad is furious." "Richard, the hotel manager is bringing a master key. If you are playing games, you will regret it. Open the door now." I read their messages not with fear, but with the cold, analytical eye of a forensic accountant. This was not normal annoyance over a ruined family dinner. This was sheer, unadulterated panic. They needed that signature tonight, which meant whatever deadline they were facing was real, and whatever asset they were trying to steal from me was massive. My thumb hovered over the power button. Let them break in. Let them find the empty room. They could not force a signature from a ghost. I powered down the device, completely cutting off their digital leash. The Cabo airport was practically deserted at this hour. I paid the driver with cash, rushed through the automatic doors, and found the ticket counter for the last outbound flight to Los Angeles. I paid an exorbitant fee for a last-minute ticket on a red-eye flight. Boarding the plane felt like stepping into a sanctuary. As I sank into my window seat, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I spent the next 2 hours staring out at the pitch-black sky over the Pacific Ocean. Whoever sent that warning text had saved my life, or at least my financial future. But the mystery gnawed at me. Who knew about the documents? Who knew I was an accountant who would understand the trap? The wheels of the plane slammed against the tarmac at Los Angeles International Airport. The cabin lights flickered on, and the flight attendant announced our arrival. Passengers began groggily unbuckling their seatbelts. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and held the power button until the screen lit up. I expected a barrage of missed calls and furious voicemails from my father. Instead, a single text message popped up on the lock screen. It was from the same untraceable number that had warned me at the restaurant. The message was chillingly brief. "I am waiting at Gate 4 with the FBI." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my mind struggling to process the text message. I walked off the jet bridge, and merged into the early morning flow of travelers at Los Angeles International Airport. The terminal was quiet, filled with the dull hum of rolling suitcases and tired whispers. My eyes scanned the concourse as I approached Gate 4. Standing near an empty ticketing counter were three men. Two of them wore the kind of nondescript, sharply tailored suits that screamed federal government and high hourly billing rates. But it was the third man who made my steps falter. Standing between them was DeAndre. He was my half-sister Penelope's husband. DeAndre was a brilliant self-made architect, a proud African-American man who had built his own firm from the ground up. I had always wondered how someone so grounded and intelligent ended up marrying into my toxic family. Whenever Richard and Caroline hosted their lavish country club dinners, they loved to parade DeAndre around like a trophy, using his race and his architectural success to project a fake image of diversity and progressive values. Behind closed doors, I knew they subjected him to endless microaggressions and elitist snobbery. DeAndre stepped forward as I approached. The exhaustion in his eyes mirrored my own, but there was a sharp, furious determination in his posture. I sent the text. Madeline DeAndre said, his voice low and steady. I am done. I am completely done being a prop for a family of racist, elitist frauds. I found something at the house, something that changes everything. And I brought it straight to the people who can burn them to the ground. The man on DeAndre's left opened his jacket just enough to flash a gold badge clipped to his belt, Special Agent Russo, FBI Financial Crimes Division. The older gentleman on the right extended a hand. Arthur Gallagher. I am a trust and estate litigator. We need to speak privately, Madeline. Right now. My forensic accountant instincts flared. You do not bring an estate litigator and an FBI agent to an airport at dawn for a family misunderstanding. I nodded silently. Russo led us away from the public terminal and badged us through a restricted access door, guiding us down a sterile corridor into a private airline VIP lounge that had been secured for our meeting. The room was soundproof and smelled of expensive leather and strong coffee. I sat down on a heavy sofa. DeAndre sat across from me, his jaw clenched tight. Gallagher took the seat adjacent to mine and placed a massive manila folder on the glass coffee table. Madeline Gallagher began, his tone clinically precise. As a forensic accountant, you are accustomed to uncovering paper trails. Today, we are going to look at yours. I need you to brace yourself. Everything you believe about your childhood and your estrangement from your family is a carefully constructed legal fiction. I frowned, crossing my arms. I know who my family is. They hated me. When I was 11 years old, Caroline accused me of pushing Penelope down a flight of stairs. It was a lie, but Richard used it to send me to a disciplinary camp for troubled youth. They kicked me out. Gallagher shook his head slowly. You were not sent away as a punishment, Madeline. You were sent away because your absence and your fabricated behavioral issues were required for a court filing. Richard did not just send you to a camp. He used those false accusations of violence to petition a sympathetic judge to establish a permanent conservatorship over you. He declared you a danger to yourself and others, legally stripping you of your autonomy. My breath caught in my throat. A conservatorship, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why? Why would they go through a complex, expensive legal battle to control a child they did not even want around? DeAndre leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because of the money, Maddie. 2 weeks ago, I was looking for some old architectural blueprints in Penelope's home office. I found a hidden safe behind the drywall. I cracked it. Inside, I found 2 decades worth of shadow ledgers. They have been stealing from you since you were a little girl. Stealing what? I asked, my head spinning. I have nothing. My biological mother died when I was a toddler. Richard always told me she left nothing but unpaid hospital bills and bad credit. That was the biggest lie of all, Gallagher said. He opened the manila folder and slid a yellowed legal document toward me. Your biological mother was a software engineer in the early days of Silicon Valley. Before she passed away, she patented a core algorithm used in data encryption. She placed the rights to that patent and the resulting licensing royalties into an irrevocable trust. You are the sole beneficiary. I stared at the signature on the faded paper. It was my mother's name. A woman I barely remembered had secured my future, and my father had stolen it. Agent Russo finally spoke his voice, carrying the heavy weight of federal authority. Over the last 22 years, the tech sector exploded. The royalties from your mother's patent grew exponentially. Your trust fund is currently valued at $80 million. The number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 80 million. I thought about the nights I spent crying in my cheap college apartment, eating instant noodles, drowning in student loan debt, begging for a tiny loan just to buy textbooks. I thought about how Richard and Caroline flaunted their wealth buying Penelope luxury cars and funding her vanity jewelry business while treating me like a charity case. It was all my money. Every single cent of their elite lifestyle was funded by the mother they told me was worthless. The conservatorship gave Richard total control over the trust's distributions, Gallagher explained, tapping the file. But there was a catch. Your mother's trust was ironclad in one specific regard. The conservatorship loophole expires the moment you turn 33. The trust reaches full maturity and the 80 million transfers entirely into your sole legal possession. I turned 33 last month. I whispered, my mind racing as the horrific reality finally clicked into place. DeAndre nodded grimly. The tax document they were trying to force you to sign tonight in Cabo. It was not for Penelope's IPO. It was an irrevocable waiver. By signing it, you would have legally relinquished your beneficiary rights and transferred the entire $80 million directly into a corporate holding company controlled by Richard and Penelope. They isolated you in Mexico to pressure you into signing away your life right at the finish line. The sheer scale of the betrayal crashed down on me. My father had institutionalized me at 11 years old, branded me a violent sociopath, and subjected me to a lifetime of emotional abuse, all to hijack a fortune left to me by a dead woman. The air in the VIP lounge suddenly felt far too thin. The edges of my vision began to blur into a static gray. I tried to take a breath, but my lungs refused to expand. I heard DeAndre shout my name, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he jumped up. The sound of his voice faded into a high-pitched ringing. The $80 million, the 22 years of lies, the document in Cabo, it was too much for my nervous system to process. The room tilted violently sideways and I plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. I slowly surfaced from the suffocating darkness. The sharp scent of rubbing alcohol and the steady rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor grounded me. I peeled my eyes open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. I was lying in a hospital bed, an intravenous line taped to the back of my hand. The room was small, sterile, and entirely private. DeAndre was sitting in a vinyl visitor chair beside my bed, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He looked exhausted, but his gaze was sharp and focused. As soon as he saw my eyes open, he poured a cup of ice water from a plastic pitcher and handed it to me. You are in a private medical facility, cleared by Agent Russo. DeAndre said, his voice a low, steady rumble. You went into shock at the airport. The doctor said your vitals spiked dangerously high, but you are stable now. I took a slow sip of the cold water, letting the reality of the $80 million and my father's 22-year-long betrayal wash over me again. This time I did not panic. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline fury. I sat up and pulled the intravenous needle out of my hand, pressing a cotton ball against the bead of blood. Tell me exactly how you found out, I demanded, looking directly at my brother-in-law. Why would Richard leave a paper trail? DeAndre let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Because arrogant people always think they are untouchable. A month ago, Penelope decided she wanted to demolish a load-bearing wall in the master suite to expand her shoe closet. As an architect, I needed the original structural blueprints of the mansion to make sure the house would not collapse. I went into Richard's private study to dig through the old property archives. I noticed the dimensions of the room did not match the floor plan. There was a false wall behind a mahogany bookshelf. He leaned back, his eyes darkening with absolute disgust. I found a hidden wall safe. I know how to crack old dial safes from my early days working construction gigs. When I popped it open, I did not find blueprints. I found the shadow ledgers, Decades of bank transfers, offshore routing numbers, and fake invoices. DeAndre shook his head, running a hand over his face. You know how they treat me, Maddie. Richard and Caroline love to parade me around at their country club galas. They love showing off their successful black son-in-law to prove how progressive and diverse they are. But behind closed doors, it is nothing but microaggressions, condescension, and elite snobbery. They treat me like a prop. They treat you like garbage. But when I read those ledgers, I realize the ultimate sick joke. Their entire empire of superiority was funded by the orphaned 11-year-old girl they threw into a disciplinary camp. Penelope's luxury jewelry company, Caroline's charity galas, Richard's real estate portfolio, every single dime was stolen from your mother's tech patent. The door to the private room opened. Attorney Gallagher and Agent Russo stepped inside, both looking relieved to see me sitting up. Madeline Gallagher said, smoothing his tie, "We need to move quickly. I have drafted an emergency injunction to present to a federal judge. We can freeze the conservatorship, file a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty, and start the long process of recovering your assets through litigation." "No," I said flatly. Gallagher paused, looking confused. "Madeline, if we do not file a lawsuit immediately, Richard might realize you are on to him and start moving the money to non-extradition jurisdictions." I swung my legs over the side of the hospital bed and stood up. "I am a forensic accountant, Mr. Gallagher. I spend my life auditing corporate criminals. If we file a standard civil suit, Richard will hire a dozen expensive defense attorneys. They will stall the discovery process for years. They will bleed the trust dry with legal fees. They will drag my name through the mud, claiming I am a mentally unstable daughter having a delusional episode. I am not going to sue them. I am going to annihilate them." Agent Russo crossed his arms, an appreciative smirk playing on his lips. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want a full covert financial audit," I said, pacing the small room. "I want to map out every shell company, every offshore account, and every dirty transaction Richard has authorized since I was 11. I want to build a bulletproof federal criminal case. When we strike, I do not want to just freeze their accounts. I want to humiliate them. I want to repossess the mansion. I want to strip Penelope of her fake business. I want Richard and Caroline in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement." DeAndre stood up, a dangerous smile spreading across his face. "I like the way you think, Maddie, but you are going to need someone on the inside. Richard uses an encrypted local server in his study to process the offshore transfers. If the FBI tries to hack it remotely, his security software will wipe the hard drives instantly." "You want to be my mole," I said, meeting his gaze. "I am going back to that mansion," DeAndre confirmed. "I will plant mirroring software directly on his physical server. I will copy every email, every text message, and every bank routing number. I will hand you the matches and you can burn them to the ground." Before Gallagher could warn us about the legal risks of corporate espionage, a sharp buzzing sound shattered the tension in the room. I reached into my pocket. My phone, which I had turned back on after landing at LAX, was vibrating violently. The caller ID displayed a name that made my blood run cold. Richard. I held up a finger, signaling for absolute silence in the room. I cleared my throat, forcing my vocal cords to relax, and swiped to answer the call. "Madeline," Richard said. His voice was not screaming. It was worse. It was dripping with a sickening artificial sweetness, the tone of a predator playing a very dangerous game. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice shaky and weak. "I am so sorry about last night. I was so sick from the food I panicked and flew home." "Oh, sweetie, we know," Richard cooed smoothly. "Caroline and I were just so worried about our little girl. We could not possibly stay in Cabo while you were suffering, so we hopped on the company jet right after you left. In fact, we are standing outside your apartment door right now. Open up, Madeline. We came to take care of you." I gripped the phone tighter, forcing a weak, wet cough into my throat before answering. "Dad, I am not inside the apartment. I am at the urgent care clinic 2 blocks away. They just finished giving me an intravenous drip for severe dehydration. I am walking back to the building right now. Give me 10 minutes. I ended the call immediately, not giving him a chance to argue or offer to pick me up. I looked up at the men in the VIP lounge. Special Agent Russo stepped forward and reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a tiny matte black disc no larger than a shirt button, with a small adhesive strip on the back. "They are going to tear your place apart," Russo said, placing the device in the palm of my hand. "They need your personal identification, your passport, or your official signature stamps to execute whatever fraud they have planned now that the Mexico trap failed. Let them inside, play the broken medicated victim, and plant this audio transmitter on them before they leave." I thanked Gallagher, and Russo exchanged a brief, determined nod with DeAndre and rushed out the back exit of the private terminal. I took a taxi straight to my neighborhood, using the short ride to perfectly craft my disguise. I rigorously scrubbed the makeup off my face until my skin looked raw and pale. I ruffled my hair to make it look unwashed and pulled my dark hoodie tightly around my shaking shoulders. I needed to look like a woman utterly defeated by illness and fear. When I stepped off the elevator on my floor, I saw them immediately. Richard, Caroline, and Penelope were standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway of my modest apartment building. They looked entirely out of place, draped in luxury designer clothing and radiating impatient entitlement. Penelope was holding her nose loudly, complaining about the smell of the hallway carpet. As soon as Richard spotted me, his rigid, angry posture vanished. He rushed forward, wrapping his arms around me in a suffocating, aggressive embrace. "Madeline, my poor girl," he announced loudly, playing the part of a distressed, loving father for the benefit of any neighbors who might be listening. He practically shoved me toward my front door. "Get your keys out. You need to be in bed immediately." I unlocked the door with deliberately trembling hands. The moment the deadbolt clicked open, they swarmed inside like a tactical strike team. The illusion of parental concern evaporated the second the door shut behind us. I slumped onto my cheap fabric sofa, clutching my stomach and letting out a pathetic groan. Richard did not even offer me a glass of water. He marched straight to my small wooden desk in the corner of the living room and began aggressively yanking the drawers open. "We need to get your insurance information," he claimed, his hands furiously shuffling through my mail bank statements and utility bills. "And your passport. We have to manage the international cancellation fees for the resort on your behalf." As a forensic accountant, watching him work was highly revealing. He was lying. He was hunting for my official identification documents, specifically looking for a clean copy of my signature or my social security card. Caroline completely bypassed the kitchen. She marched straight into my bedroom, and I could hear her tearing through my closet. She loudly claimed she was looking for comfortable pajamas, but the distinct heavy sound of my filing box being snapped open told a different story. They were tearing my private sanctuary apart to find the legal seals required to forge a waiver for an $80 million trust fund. Penelope remained in the living room. She stood in the exact center of the space with her arms crossed, refusing to touch anything, as if my apartment were contaminated. "God, it smells like public transportation in here," she sneered, kicking her luxury heel against the leg of my coffee table. "Is this sofa from a thrift store? I cannot believe you live like this by choice. It is actually pathetic." She pulled out her phone and blatantly took a photo of my small living room, likely to send to her wealthy friends to mock me. I kept my head down, forcing a pathetic whimper. "I am just so tired," I mumbled, leaning my head back against the cushions and closing my eyes. Caroline walked back into the living room, her face tight with frustration. She dropped her massive, heavy designer handbag right onto the coffee table, inches from my knees. "She does not have her primary documents anywhere obvious." Caroline snapped at Richard, completely dropping the concerned mother act. "Can someone please get me some water?" I rasped, letting a fake tear slide down my cheek. "I feel so dizzy." Richard scoffed in disgust, waving a hand at Penelope to go to the kitchen. For exactly 4 seconds, all three of their backs were turned away from me. Penelope was grabbing a plastic cup, Richard was slamming my desk drawer shut in defeat, and Caroline was looking out the window. I slipped the tiny black transmitter from my pocket. My hand moved with lightning speed. I pressed the adhesive back of the bug deep under the thick leather strap hinge of Caroline's handbag. It blended perfectly with the dark metal hardware. It was completely invisible unless someone explicitly dismantled the bag. I let my arm fall limply back to my side just a fraction of a second before Penelope shoved a cup of tap water into my hand. I had intentionally hidden my highly sensitive documents in a locked safe deposit box at my bank years ago. They were never going to find anything useful here. We will let you rest, Madeline. Richard said, his voice turning ice cold now that the search had proven fruitless. You need heavy sleep. Do not answer your phone. Do not talk to anyone. We will handle everything from here. I am so sorry I ruined the family trip, I whispered, closing my eyes and letting my head loll to the side to sell the performance. Caroline snatched her handbag off the coffee table. You always ruin everything, she muttered bitterly. They marched out of my apartment, the heavy front door clicking firmly shut behind them. I sat perfectly still and counted to 10 in my head. When I reached 10, I sat up perfectly straight. The sick, weak demeanor vanished instantly. I walked briskly to my kitchen counter, flipped open my laptop, and launched the encrypted software Russo had provided. A green waveform spiked across the screen. The audio feed was live and crystal clear. I heard the distinct sound of the elevator dinging, followed by the heavy metallic slide of the doors closing. Then Richard's furious, echoing voice filled my kitchen. She hid her documents. It does not matter. Call the dirty notary. We will forge her signature tomorrow. The audio feed crackled as the elevator descended, but the words were crystal clear. Call the dirty notary. We will forge her signature tomorrow. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I simply pressed a key to save the recording, uploaded it to the secure server Russo had provided, and poured myself a cup of black coffee. The time for emotional reactions was over. It was time to do what I do best: follow the money. By noon, I was sitting in a windowless conference room inside the Los Angeles FBI field office. The walls were covered in whiteboard material, and Special Agent Russo was sliding a fresh stack of bank records across a heavy metal table. DeAndre had successfully mirrored Richard's private server overnight, providing us with a massive data dump of 22 years of financial history. Now it was just a matter of untangling the web. Forensic accounting is not about dramatic interrogations or screaming matches. It is about patience, cold logic, and an absolute obsession with discrepancies. People lie, but numbers never do. I pulled up the primary ledger for the conservatorship. Richard had been appointed my legal guardian, which gave him a fiduciary duty to manage my biological mother's tech patent royalties strictly for my benefit. Instead, he had built a labyrinth of corporate fraud. I opened my laptop and began projecting spreadsheets onto the main monitor. Russo stood beside me, arms crossed, watching as I highlighted the first anomaly. Look at this routing sequence, I said, pointing to a series of transfers originating from the primary trust account in 2010. Richard authorized a withdrawal of $4 million under the guise of specialized medical care and residential treatment facilities for my supposed behavioral issues. But the receiving account does not belong to a medical facility. It belongs to a limited liability company registered in Delaware called Apex Holdings. Russo tapped his chin. And Apex Holdings is controlled by your father. Exactly, I replied. But he layered it. Apex Holdings then transferred the funds to a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, which then issued a supposed corporate loan to Caroline's personal wealth management account. From there, the money was washed and integrated into their daily spending. He has been doing this every quarter for over 2 decades. He fabricates an expense for my care, funnels the cash through 3 layers of shell companies, and brings it back into his own pocket as clean, untraceable income. For the next 6 hours, Russo and I methodically ripped apart Richard's financial empire. I traced every wire transfer, every fake invoice, and every inflated expense report. The sheer volume of their theft was breathtaking, but their execution was arrogant and sloppy. They never expected anyone to look this closely. They certainly never expected the discarded daughter to be the one holding the magnifying glass. As the afternoon wore on, I began to map out their physical assets against the stolen funds. The revelations were staggering. I pulled up the property deed for the sprawling mega mansion where Richard and Caroline currently lived, the same house where they had hosted countless high society galas. The down payment for the estate was wired directly from a dummy corporation funded entirely by my mother's patent royalties, I explained, circling the transaction dates. The monthly mortgage payments are drawn from a trust account Richard set up using my social security number. Legally, that house does not belong to him. It belongs to me. Russo let out a low whistle. What about the vehicles? I ran the vehicle identification numbers through the California Department of Motor Vehicles database and cross-referenced them with the Shell Company ledgers. I found the purchase agreements for Penelope's fleet of luxury cars. 3 Porsches and a vintage Mercedes. Every single one was purchased through a corporate lease program funded by Apex Holdings. I own the cars she drives. I own the insurance policies on them. But the most satisfying discovery was yet to come. I opened the financial disclosures for Penelope's luxury jewelry brand, the company she was desperately trying to take public with her upcoming initial public offering. She had spent years cultivating an image as a brilliant self-made entrepreneur, a golden child who built an empire through hard work and flawless taste. I isolated the initial seed funding for her company, a capital injection of $12 million that had miraculously appeared in her business accounts 5 years ago. I traced the routing numbers backward. The money moved from Penelope's business account to a venture capital firm in Nevada, to a holding company in the Bahamas, and finally right back into my primary trust fund. The $12 million used to launch her entire brand was classified in Richard's hidden ledger as an educational and occupational therapy grant for my rehabilitation. I said, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. Penelope is not a self-made founder. She is a fraud. Her entire company, her inventory, her branding, it was all built using my mother's money. Since the capital was fraudulently acquired from my trust, I am the senior creditor and the rightful majority shareholder of her business. Russo leaned against the table, a sharp smile forming on his face. So let me get this straight. The house they sleep in, the cars they drive, the company, they are trying to take public. You own it all. Legally, yes, I replied, closing the spreadsheet. They are living a billionaire lifestyle, but on paper they are completely insolvent. I own the roof over their heads and the clothes on their backs. And once we secure the audit authorization, I can liquidate everything they have in a matter of hours. Just as I finished speaking, my phone buzzed on the table. It was not a standard text message, but an alert from a highly encrypted messaging app DeAndre and I had set up earlier that morning. I opened the application and decrypted the text block. The message was brief, but it held the key to our next move. DeAndre wrote, Penelope is in a complete panic. They know they need massive liquidity before the audit next week. She is hosting an exclusive high society dinner party at the mansion this Saturday night. She is bringing in the final tier of major venture capitalists to secure the last round of funding for the jewelry brand before it goes public. The guest list is a who is who of Los Angeles elite. I stared at the glowing text, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. Richard and Caroline thought I was a broken, medicated mess recovering in my cheap apartment. They were about to host the most important night of their lives, completely unaware that the girl they had thrown away was now the legal owner of the very house they were entertaining in. I looked up at Agent Russo. It seems my sister is throwing a party this weekend to sell my company to a room full of billionaires. Russo raised an eyebrow. What do you want to do about it? I closed my laptop and stood up. I think it is time I finally showed up to a family dinner. Saturday evening arrived with the stifling heat typical of Los Angeles. I pulled up to the heavily guarded gates of Richard's Bel Air estate in a standard rideshare sedan. DeAndre had quietly removed my name from the security blacklist that morning, allowing my driver to pass right through the wrought iron gates without a second glance from the guards. I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. I was not wearing a power suit or a designer gown. To sell my performance, I wore a plain beige cardigan, flat shoes, and minimal makeup. I needed to look exactly like the broken, medicated woman they had left in my apartment. I walked through the towering mahogany front doors. The mansion was buzzing with the quiet, expensive hum of high society. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over men in bespoke tuxedos and women draped in diamonds. Waiters glided silently across the marble floors, carrying trays of champagne and caviar. In the center of the grand dining room stood Penelope, radiant in a custom emerald gown, laughing brightly as she entertained a circle of older, distinguished men. These were the venture capitalists. the apex predators of the financial world, ready to write massive checks to take her jewelry brand public. I stepped into the light of the dining room. It only took 4 seconds for Caroline to spot me. Her champagne flute froze halfway to her lips. The color drained from her face. She immediately elbowed Richard, who whipped his head around. His eyes widened in absolute panic. He took a step toward me, signaling for the private security guards near the hallway. But Penelope was faster, and Penelope was a narcissist. She saw an opportunity to play the benevolent, successful savior in front of her most important investors. Instead of letting security drag me out and causing a scene, she smiled brightly and glided across the room, grabbing my arm with a tight, painful grip. "Everyone?" Penelope announced, her voice echoing perfectly through the dining room to ensure total attention. "I am so glad you are all here for this special moment. This is my older half-sister, Madeline." The investors turned their attention to me, taking in my plain clothes and slumped posture. Penelope sighed, putting a manicured hand over her heart to feign deep empathy. Madeline has struggled with severe mental health instability for most of her life. She has had a very difficult time, and she recently suffered a terrible episode during our family vacation. But she came all the way here tonight because she is on a new treatment plan and wants to make amends. We believe in second chances in this family. Is that right, Maddie? She squeezed my arm hard enough to leave a bruise. It was a masterclass in public humiliation. She painted herself as a saint while branding me a volatile charity case. I kept my head bowed, staring at the floor, and let a tremor enter my voice. "I am so sorry for ruining the trip," I mumbled softly, playing the submissive role flawlessly. "I just wanted to come and apologize to everyone. I am so proud of you, Penelope. I do not want to intrude on your big night." The investors murmured with sympathetic approval. Penelope beamed, soaking up their admiration. She gestured toward a tall, older man with silver hair and a sharp gaze. "This is Mr. Kensington. His firm is leading the final round of funding for my IPO. They are going to take my brand global." Penelope released my arm and turned back to a waiter to order another drink, completely dismissing me as a non-threat. Richard and Caroline visibly relaxed, assuming I was properly cowed and heavily medicated. They returned to their networking, leaving me standing at the edge of the investor circle. Mr. Kensington gave me a polite, pitying smile. "It is nice to meet you, Madeline. Your sister is a brilliant founder. You must be very proud of the empire she built from scratch." "I am," I said, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "I am just a simple bookkeeper, but I love reading about business. I actually read through her public disclosures for the IPO. It is fascinating how she managed the initial capital injection." Kensington chuckled, swirling his scotch. "Yes, a $12 million seed round, fully self-funded by the family. It shows incredible discipline, no outside debt. It makes the valuation incredibly clean for the public offering." I tilted my head, furrowing my brow as if I were slightly confused. "Oh, is it clean? I thought there might be a small issue with the SEC compliance regarding the asset backing. But again, I just do basic accounting. I am sure you guys already caught it during the due diligence phase." Kensington stopped swirling his scotch. His smile faded just a fraction. "Caught what exactly?" I took a slow sip from a glass of water a passing waiter had handed me. "Well, I noticed that the $12 million originated from a holding company in the Bahamas, which is perfectly normal. But the routing sequence shows the funds were actually classified as a medical and educational trust disbursement, not a corporate investment loan. According to the federal tax code, commingling a protected fiduciary trust fund with corporate revenue instantly invalidates the corporate shield." Kensington went completely still. The other investors in the circle had stopped talking and were now listening intently to my supposedly innocent observations. I continued, keeping my tone light and conversational. Since the capital was fraudulently misclassified, the original trust beneficiary would legally be considered the senior creditor. That means Penelope does not actually own the controlling shares of the company she is trying to take public. The trust does. If she files those S-1 registration documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission next week, she will be committing federal securities fraud. But I am sure your legal team already drafted the indemnification clauses to protect your firm from the federal indictments, right? The color drained entirely from Kensington's face. He was not looking at a broken, medicated woman anymore. He was staring at an apex predator who had just casually dissected a multi-million-dollar fraud right in front of him. Are you telling me, Kensington asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper, that the seed capital is tied to an active, contested trust? I gave him a sad, apologetic smile. I am just saying that if a federal auditor, or say the FBI Financial Crimes Division, were to subpoena the holding company records, they would find that the assets are currently frozen. It would be a terrible shame if your firm's money was locked in a federal seizure. But Penelope is so smart. I am sure she has a plan to pay you all back when the assets are repossessed. I watched the realization hit him like a freight train. The panic in his eyes was immediate. He looked across the room at Penelope, who was laughing loudly, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire financial future was currently bleeding out on the dining room floor. Kensington abruptly set his glass down on a passing tray. He did not say another word to me. He simply turned to his associates, gave a sharp nod, and headed straight for the front door. I stood in the corner of the dining room, holding my water glass, and watched the panic begin to spread. The dominoes were officially falling. I watched the panic begin to spread. Mr. Kensington did not simply walk to the exit. He moved with the urgent, terrifying speed of a man trying to outrun a financial avalanche. He intercepted two of his partners near the grand staircase, leaning in to whisper something sharp and fast. I could see the exact moment the blood drained from their faces. Penelope noticed the sudden shift in energy. She glided over, offering a silver tray of champagne, flashing her most brilliant, practiced smile. Kensington waved her off, his face a mask of cold professionalism. He told her his compliance team needed to review some sudden discrepancies in her paperwork and that he would be in touch. He was lying, and they both knew it. Within 10 minutes, the other major investors followed suit. They cited early flights, sudden headaches, and family emergencies. The mass exodus was brutal, silent, and incredibly efficient. By 11 o'clock, the lavish dining room was entirely empty of guests. The catered food sat untouched on silver platters. The string quartet had been dismissed early. I slipped behind one of the towering marble pillars in the grand foyer, keeping myself completely out of sight, but with a clear view of the dining room. The heavy mahogany front doors clicked shut behind the final investor. Penelope's perfect mask completely dissolved. She let out a scream of pure, unadulterated rage that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the stolen mansion. She grabbed a heavy crystal centerpiece filled with white orchids and hurled it blindly across the room. It shattered against a mahogany credenza, sending jagged glass and water exploding across the pristine hardwood floor. Caroline rushed forward, holding out her hands, trying to soothe her golden child, but Penelope violently shoved her own mother away. Penelope then turned her terrifying fury toward DeAndre. He was standing calmly near the bar, watching her meltdown with absolutely zero emotion. She marched up to him, her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl. She screamed that this was entirely his fault. She accused him of being incompetent, of telling the security guards to let me through the gates, of deliberately trying to sabotage her success because he was jealous of her wealth and status. She mocked his background, sneering that he could never understand the pressure of building a real empire. DeAndre did not raise his voice. He did not flinch. He simply stood his ground and told her that she needed to calm down before she broke something she could not afford to replace. That was the wrong thing to say. Penelope grabbed a half-full wine glass from the table and launched it directly at his head. DeAndre tilted his neck just in time. The heavy crystal smashed against the wall right behind him, showering his broad shoulders with expensive red wine and shards of glass. What Penelope did not know was that DeAndre was wearing a high-resolution microcamera built directly into his designer tie clip. Every unhinged scream, every shattered glass, and every vicious elitist insult was currently streaming straight to the secure federal server Agent Russo had set up for us. Penelope paced the dining room like a caged animal, her custom emerald gown stained with dark wine. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Richard. She demanded that he fix this immediately. She screamed that her entire initial public offering was dead unless the financial disclosures were legally cleared by the end of the week. She looked her father dead in the eye and shrieked at the top of her lungs, forced the freak to sign the papers by any means necessary. I do not care what you have to do. Break her arm if you have to. Just get me that signature. Richard's face was dark purple with rage. He nodded firmly, promising his golden child that he would handle me personally. I had heard enough. I turned and quietly slipped out the front door, pulling my plain beige cardigan tight against the cool night air. I walked briskly down the long, sweeping cobblestone driveway, heading toward the main gates where I had scheduled my rideshare to pick me up. The eerie quiet of the estate grounds was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos unfolding inside the mansion. I was halfway down the driveway when the heavy oak front doors slammed open. Heavy, aggressive footsteps crunched against the cobblestone behind me, moving incredibly fast. I did not run. I stopped and turned around slowly. Richard marched toward me. The charming, sophisticated patriarch who had toasted to his brilliant daughter just an hour ago was gone. The man standing in front of me was the real Richard, cold, ruthless, and terrifyingly desperate. He closed the distance between us in seconds, backing me up until my shoulders hit the rough stone of the perimeter wall. He planted one hand on the wall next to my head, physically trapping me in his shadow. He leaned in close, his breath hot and smelling of expensive scotch. "I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing," he hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I do not know what garbage you were whispering to Kensington to scare him off. But you are going to fix this." I kept my face perfectly blank, channeling the broken, heavily medicated persona they expected to see. "I did not do anything, Dad. I was just talking about accounting principles." He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Drop the act, Madeline. You think you are smart because you read a few balance sheets? You are nothing. You are the same unstable, worthless liability you have always been. We need that tax document signed by Friday so Penelope can close her funding round." I looked down at the ground, forcing my voice to tremble. "I cannot sign it. It does not feel right." Richard let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He leaned closer, his voice vibrating with absolute venom. "You do not have a choice. If I do not have your signature on that waiver by 5 o'clock this Friday, I will destroy whatever pathetic little life you have managed to build for yourself. I will drag you into court. I will file a massive civil suit against you for 22 years of back child support, housing expenses, medical bills, and every single dime I spent keeping you locked up in that disciplinary camp." He tightened his grip on my arm, shaking me slightly to emphasize his power. "I will garnish your pathetic wages. I will drain your bank accounts. I will bury you under so much legal debt that you will be begging to live on the streets. You have until Friday, Madeline. Sign the paper, or I will wipe you off the map." He shoved me back against the stone wall, turned around, and marched back toward his stolen mansion. I stood alone in the dark driveway. I rubbed my bruised arm, watching his silhouette disappear. He thought he had just issued a death sentence. He had no idea he had just handed me the exact timeline I needed to execute my final strike. I watched Richard's silhouette fade into the manicured shadows of the estate. Friday at 5 o'clock. He thought he had given me an ultimatum, but he had actually handed me a detonation timer. I smoothed my plain beige cardigan, walked out the iron gates, and slipped into the back of my waiting rideshare. I did not go back to my apartment. I directed the driver to a subterranean parking garage in downtown Los Angeles, a secure rendezvous point we had established earlier that day. The concrete structure was cold and completely deserted at 2 in the morning. A black SUV idled in the far corner of the lowest sublevel. As I approached, the headlights flashed once. DeAndre stepped out of the driver's side. He had changed out of his wine-stained tuxedo into dark jeans and a plain jacket. His face was a mask of pure exhaustion, but his eyes burned with a sharp, unrelenting focus. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, encrypted solid-state drive. He handed it to me. The metal casing felt freezing against my palm. "Everything is on here," DeAndre said, his voice echoing slightly against the concrete pillars. I pulled the physical backup from Richard's hidden server right after the catering staff cleared out. The entire financial history, the offshore accounts, the email archives. It is a complete digital footprint. I thanked him, sliding the drive securely into my bag. I quickly relayed the ultimatum Richard had delivered in the driveway. DeAndre just shook his head, utterly disgusted by the sheer arrogance of a man who thought he could still control the narrative through brute force and intimidation. We needed to know exactly how deep the corruption ran before Friday arrived. We drove together to the local FBI field office where Agent Russo was already brewing a fresh pot of coffee waiting for the data drop. The windowless conference room felt like a military bunker. I connected the drive to Russo's isolated federal terminal. It took the decryption software less than 20 minutes to bypass Richard's rudimentary security protocols. A massive directory of folders populated the screen. I bypassed the offshore routing numbers we had already mapped out and dove straight into the legal communications. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of the conservatorship. How had Richard managed to keep me legally bound as an incapacitated dependent for 22 years without a single mandatory court hearing, psychiatric evaluation, or wellness check? The answer was buried in an encrypted email folder labeled Judicial Maintenance. I opened the digital correspondence. The emails were exchanged between Richard and the family's high-powered estate attorney, a man named Donovan. I read the messages aloud as Russo and DeAndre listened. Donovan was not just navigating legal loopholes. He was actively orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar bribery scheme. Every 3 years, when the conservatorship required a judicial review to remain active, Donovan would file fabricated psychological evaluations claiming I was a violent danger to myself and completely unfit to manage my own affairs. But fabricated medical records are never enough to bypass a physical court appearance. They needed a judge who would rubber stamp the paperwork without asking questions. I pulled up the bank transfer logs attached to Donovan's emails. They showed a consistent recurring payment of $50,000 routed to a shell company in Nevada. Russo ran the corporate entity through the federal database. The holding company belonged to the brother-in-law of the presiding family court judge who had overseen my conservatorship case for 2 decades. The justice system was not just broken, it was bought and paid for. Richard and Donovan were paying off a corrupt judge to keep me legally shackled and entirely invisible to the outside world. But something about the routing numbers for the most recent bribe payment caught DeAndre's attention. He stepped closer to the glowing monitor, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He asked me to pull up the origin account for a specific $50,000 wire transfer dated just 3 months ago. I traced the transaction backward. It did not originate from Richard's primary trust account or Caroline's offshore holdings. The funds had been transferred directly from a domestic high-yield savings account registered under Penelope's name. DeAndre pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were suddenly shaking. He opened his banking application and pulled up his personal family portfolio. He compared the account number on my screen to the numbers on his phone. The color drained completely from his face. The silence in the conference room became absolute and suffocating. "What is it?" I asked gently, recognizing the physical symptoms of a profound life-altering betrayal. DeAndre stared at the screen, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "It is the college fund. It is my son's educational savings plan." Russo and I exchanged a stunned look. Penelope had not just funded a federal crime, she had stolen from her own child to do it. DeAndre explained that he had set up that specific high-yield account the week their boy was born. He had poured his own hard-earned money from his architectural firm into it, wanting to ensure his son would never have to worry about student loans or the kind of crushing financial stress DeAndre had fought through as a young black man building his career from nothing. Penelope had administrative access to the account for emergencies. When it came time to pay Donovan the latest bribe for the corrupt judge, Richard must have been dealing with a temporary liquidity issue. Instead of waiting or liquidating an asset, Penelope drained her own son's educational future to pay off a dirty lawyer and keep her luxurious lifestyle afloat. She sacrificed her child's security just to keep my money locked away and her fake jewelry empire running. I watched something fundamental break behind DeAndre's eyes. The last lingering shred of loyalty he might have felt toward the mother of his child evaporated into thin air. He was a proud, dedicated father who had built his life on integrity and hard work. And he had just discovered that the woman he married was not merely an elitist snob, but a ruthless criminal who would cannibalize her own offspring without a second thought. DeAndre slowly put his phone back into his pocket. He stood up from the conference table. The heavy exhaustion that had weighed him down all night was completely gone, replaced by a terrifying cold-blooded clarity. He looked at me, his expression harder than carved stone. "Burn them all to the ground, Madeline," DeAndre said, his voice vibrating with absolute unyielding rage. "Give me the signal and I will pull the pin." I nodded at DeAndre, the silent pact sealed in the harsh fluorescent light of the federal building. There was no going back. We had our inside man, we had the federal backing, and we had the motivation of absolute vengeance. But to execute the final kill shot, I needed to play my part perfectly. I needed to become the terrified prey my father expected me to be. I waited until exactly 9 o'clock the next morning to make the call. I wanted to catch Richard right as he sat down in his home office, feeling powerful and in control. Before dialing, I drank 2 cups of strong black coffee on an empty stomach to make my hands physically shake. I paced the small windowless interrogation room, forcing my breathing to become shallow and erratic. I thought about the sheer cruelty of Penelope stealing her own son's college fund. I channeled that disgust into raw, panicked energy. I hit the call button. Richard answered on the second ring. He did not say hello. He simply said my name, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dad, please," I gasped, letting my voice crack with manufactured terror. I pitched my tone higher, mimicking the broken 11-year-old girl he had sent away to a disciplinary camp. "Please do not sue me. I do not have the money for lawyers. I can barely afford my rent. I cannot go back to court. I cannot go back to a facility. Please just tell me what you want me to do." The sound of Richard's dark, rumbling laughter through the phone speaker made my skin crawl. It was a masterclass in smug, predatory satisfaction. He loved hearing me beg. He loved the illusion of total control. He played the stern but benevolent dictator perfectly, lecturing me about how my rebellion was always destined to fail. "You brought this on yourself, Madeline." Richard stated, his tone chillingly casual. "Your independence is a delusion. It always has been. Your compliance is the only thing standing between you and utter financial ruin. If you want to avoid a lawsuit that will garnish your pathetic wages for the rest of your natural life, you will do exactly as I say. You will be at Donovan's private notary office in downtown Los Angeles this Friday at exactly 4 o'clock. You will sit down, you will shut your mouth, and you will sign the tax waiver. Do we have an understanding?" I forced a wet, pathetic sob into the receiver. "Yes. Yes, Dad. I promise. I will be there. I will not cause any more trouble." When the call disconnected, my tears instantly vanished. My heart rate slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. I wiped my dry eyes and looked up at the two-way mirror in the interrogation room. The bait was set. He had swallowed it whole. On Wednesday afternoon, I sat in the polished mahogany-paneled conference room of Arthur Gallagher's high-end law firm. The chaotic, adrenaline-fueled energy of the FBI field office was replaced by the surgical, quiet precision of elite corporate litigation. Special Agent Russo leaned against the glass wall, arms crossed, while Gallagher spread a series of highly classified legal documents across the sprawling conference table. We were not going to file an emergency injunction to stop the Friday signing. That was the predictable move, the move a standard lawyer would make. If we tipped our hand now, Richard would immediately recognize the threat. He would trigger emergency financial protocols, shifting the stolen $80 million into untouchable, non-extradition cryptocurrency accounts before the federal courts could even process our paperwork. We needed him to believe he had won. We needed him comfortable, arrogant, and completely exposed. "We are going to hijack the signing," Gallagher explained, his voice low and deadly. "I have obtained a blank copy of the exact waiver Donovan plans to use on Friday. We have entirely reverse-engineered the formatting, the typography, the margins, the legal letterhead, the barcode placement at the footer. Visually, it is a flawless match to their fraudulent document. But the text itself is entirely different. I looked down at the heavy stock paper Gallagher slid toward me. It was not a relinquishment of beneficiary rights. It was a full audit authorization. It legally granted me, in my capacity as the senior creditor of the fraudulently managed trust fund, absolute and immediate executive control over every single corporate entity holding company and bank account associated with Richard, Caroline, and Penelope. It was a financial skeleton key. Once executed and notarized, it would allow the FBI to bypass months of bureaucratic red tape and freeze their assets instantaneously. But how do I swap them right in front of him? I asked, leaning over the table to study the counterfeit document. Richard will be watching me like a hawk. Caroline will probably be hovering right over my shoulder to make sure I do not try to run again. They will not let me bring my own paperwork into the secure room, and they certainly will not let me leave with theirs. The moment I put pen to paper on their waiver, I legally forfeit the $80 million. Gallagher leaned back in his plush leather chair and smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile, the kind of smile that won multi-million-dollar verdicts. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black velvet jewelry box. He set it gently on the table and turned it toward me. Inside rested a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen. It was classic, elegant, and completely unassuming. "You are going to sign their document," Madeline Gallagher said softly. "You are going to sit at that conference table. You are going to cry, and you are going to sign exactly where they tell you to sign. And then, using a distraction we have coordinated with DeAndre, you are going to slip our document into the finalized stack." I picked up the pen, testing its weight in my hand. It felt perfectly normal, balanced, and heavy. How does this help me if I actually sign their fraudulent waiver? If I sign their paper, the trust fund is legally transferred to their holding company. Gallagher's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. Because we had this pen custom engineered by a federal laboratory, it is filled with a highly specialized disappearing thermal ink. You will sign their waiver, and the signature will look absolutely flawless to the naked eye. The notary will stamp it, and Richard will put it in his briefcase. But after exactly 24 hours, the chemical compounds in the ink react to room temperature air. The ink completely vaporizes without leaving a single trace on the paper. I stared at the pen, the sheer brilliance of the trap taking my breath away. "You will leave them holding a blank, worthless piece of paper," Gallagher concluded, leaning forward. "But the document we are swapping in the audit authorization that gives you the keys to their entire empire, that document will be signed with permanent ink. You are going to walk into that room as a hostage Madeline, and you are going to walk out owning their entire world." Friday arrived with the suffocating heat typical of downtown Los Angeles. At exactly 10 minutes to 4, I stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor. The law firm exuded intimidation. Dark mahogany panels, frosted glass walls, and the hushed, sterile quiet of extreme wealth. I adjusted my oversized beige cardigan, letting my shoulders slump forward. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. The custom velvet box pen rested heavily in my right pocket alongside a standard permanent pen and the folded full audit authorization Gallagher had prepared. I walked into the coroner conference room. The atmosphere was immediately toxic. Richard sat at the head of the massive granite table, looking like a king about to witness an execution. Caroline was seated to his right, casually inspecting her flawless manicure, as if my financial ruin was merely a minor inconvenience in her afternoon schedule. Penelope sat across from them, aggressively tapping her phone screen, visibly annoyed that she had to be present at all. At the far end of the table sat Donovan, the corrupt attorney. He had a stack of legal documents arranged in a neat, deadly pile. "You are late," Richard stated. His voice bounced off the glass walls, cold and authoritative. "Sit down. Let us get this over with." I pulled out a chair, my hands visibly trembling. I did not need to fake the physical reaction. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was real. The sheer audacity of these people sitting in a multi-million-dollar office preparing to steal an $80 million trust fund from the daughter they had institutionalized was enough to make anyone shake. Donovan slid the thick stack of papers across the granite table. The fraudulent waiver sat right on top. It was formatted beautifully filled with dense, impenetrable legal jargon designed to completely erase my beneficiary rights. Sign on the yellow tabs. Donovan instructed, his tone bored and mechanical. I will notarize the final page and you can leave. I stared at the document. I let a wet, ragged sob escape my throat. Dad, please, I begged, looking up at Richard with wide, terrified eyes. Please do not make me do this. I will not cause any trouble. I just want to go back to my apartment. Please. Caroline rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, for heaven's sake, Madeline. Stop acting like a child. You brought this entirely on yourself. Just sign the paper so we can go to dinner. Penelope let out a harsh scoff, not even looking up from her phone. Honestly, it is pathetic. You always were a complete liability. Hurry up and sign it. I have a dress fitting at 5. Richard leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. His eyes were devoid of any paternal warmth. They were the eyes of a shark smelling blood in the water. We had a deal, Madeline. You sign the waiver and I do not bury you in civil litigation. Pick up the pen. I reached out with a violently shaking hand. But instead of taking the pen Donovan offered, I reached for the tall glass of ice water sitting near the center of the table. My fingers slipped against the condensation. I let out a sharp gasp as the heavy glass tipped over. The execution was flawless. A tidal wave of ice water flooded across the polished granite table, surging directly toward Caroline's lap and Penelope's designer handbag. Chaos erupted instantly. Caroline shrieked violently, pushing her chair back so hard it crashed against the wall. Penelope screamed frantically, grabbing her phone and her bag to save them from the encroaching puddle. Donovan jumped out of his seat, shouting in frustration, and turned his back to the table to grab a stack of paper towels from the sideboard. Richard stood up, slamming his fist on the table, yelling at me for being a clumsy, incompetent fool. I had exactly 5 seconds of total unobserved chaos. My hands stopped shaking. I moved with the surgical precision of a trained professional. I pulled the custom disappearing ink pen from my right pocket and slashed my signature across their fraudulent waiver in 3 distinct places. Then, using my left hand, I pulled Gallagher's visually identical full audit authorization from my hidden inner pocket. I slapped it down onto Donovan's official notary pad directly over a decoy signature page. I swapped my permanent pen into my right hand and signed the audit authorization in bold, permanent black ink. Donovan spun back around with a wad of paper towels, frantically wiping the granite table. In his haste and irritation, he did not even look at the documents. He just grabbed his heavy brass notary stamp, pressed it hard against the signature line of the full audit authorization, and tossed it toward my side of the table to save it from the water. I smoothly slid the legally notarized audit authorization back into my hidden jacket pocket. I left the fraudulent waiver signed with the vanishing ink sitting safely on the dry edge of the table. "Look what you did, you idiot," Penelope shrieked, dabbing frantically at the hem of her skirt. "You cannot even drink a glass of water without ruining everything." I shrank back into my chair, bursting into fresh hysterical tears. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." My hands were shaking. "I already signed it. It is done." I pointed a trembling finger at the waiver. Richard snatched the document off the table. He did not care about the spilled water. He did not care about my tears. He flipped straight to the final page, verifying my signature on the yellow tab. A slow, terrifyingly cruel smile spread across his face. He looked down at me, holding the piece of paper that he believed had just secured him $80 million. He laughed, a deep, resonant sound of pure victory. "You always were a gullible loser, Madeline. You let us send you away, you let us take your money, and you just handed over the keys to the kingdom because you were too weak to fight back. Get out of my sight. I never want to see your face again." I stood up, keeping my head bowed in absolute defeat. I clutched my beige cardigan tightly around my chest and walked slowly out of the conference room. I kept up the slow, shuffling gait all the way down the hallway into the elevator and through the grand lobby of the building. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun of downtown Los Angeles. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me. I stopped walking. I stood up perfectly straight. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the crisp edge of the notarized full audit authorization. The forensic accountant inside me took a deep, steadying breath of the warm city air. The tears were gone. The fear was gone. The 11-year-old victim was dead and buried. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and smiled. While I was pulling out of the downtown parking garage, gripping the steering wheel with triumphant energy, the real explosion was happening 30 miles west at the Bel Air estate. DeAndre had not gone to work that morning. He was standing in the cavernous master bedroom of the mansion waiting. He had spent the last 3 hours methodically packing his belongings into 2 heavy canvas duffel bags. More importantly, he had already packed everything his son needed. The boy was currently buckled safely into a car seat in DeAndre's SUV, parked quietly in the circular driveway. DeAndre was just waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to walk through the door. At exactly 4:30, Penelope strutted into the master suite. She was radiating smug, toxic satisfaction. She tossed her heavy designer handbag onto the velvet settee and kicked off her heels, letting out a dramatic sigh of relief. She immediately started bragging about how utterly pathetic I had looked at the notary office. She laughed about my fake tears, boasting that her upcoming initial public offering was entirely safe now. She told DeAndre that the family was finally rid of their biggest financial liability and they could go back to focusing on her jewelry empire. DeAndre did not turn around. He stood facing the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the manicured lawns funded by my stolen trust. He did not congratulate her. He did not offer her a celebratory drink. Instead, he recited a 12-digit routing number in a low, perfectly steady voice. Penelope stopped laughing. She froze, one hand still resting on the zipper of her dress. DeAndre turned around and looked his wife dead in the eye. He repeated the number. Then he told her exactly what that account was. It was their son's college fund. It was the high-yield savings account DeAndre had opened the week their boy was born. He had funded it entirely with the money from his very first independent architectural commissions. It was meant to secure their child's future, a protective barrier against the kind of crushing financial stress DeAndre had fought through as a young black man building his career from nothing. And yesterday the balance had gone to zero. Penelope immediately went on the defensive. She tried to gaslight him. She waved her hand dismissively, claiming it was just a temporary liquidity transfer. She told him it was a simple short-term bridging loan to handle some unexpected corporate overhead for her brand. She promised to put the money back next month after her investors cleared the final funding round. She told him he was overreacting and being ridiculously dramatic over a standard financial maneuver. DeAndre cut her off. He did not raise his voice, but his words hit like a physical strike. He stated the exact name of the shell company in Nevada. He named the corrupt family court judge. He told Penelope he knew she did not use the money for her business. He knew she had drained their own child's educational future to wire a $50,000 bribe to a dirty lawyer, all to maintain an illegal conservatorship over her half-sister. The blood drained from Penelope's face. The polished high society founder completely vanished. Cornered and caught in a massive federal crime, Penelope resorted to the only weapon she had left. Pure, vicious cruelty. The mask slipped completely, revealing the racist, elitist monster she truly was. She lashed out, her voice rising to a shrill, terrifying scream. She mocked his working-class background. She told him he should be on his knees thanking her family for pulling him out of obscurity. She unleashed a barrage of venomous insults, claiming his architectural firm only secured high-end contracts because Richard had introduced him to the right people. She told DeAndre he was nothing but a convenient prop, a diversity token they used to look progressive at country club dinners and charity galas. She screamed that without her family's wealth and status, he was just another nobody who would never amount to anything in their world. She justified stealing the money, claiming her family's empire was the only thing that mattered, and that their son would inherit millions anyway, making his little